The gunshot tore through Crestline Galleria at 11 at night, just as the steel security gates were halfway down and the last shoppers had already gone home. And in that frozen instant, everyone in the food court dropped or screamed, except one woman who didn't even flinch. Her name was Maëlle Fontaine, though nobody at the mall ever bothered to learn it. She was 27, heavy-set, wrapped in a gray janitor's uniform 2 sizes too big, the kind of woman people's eyes slid right past as if she were part of the furniture. For 6 hours every night she pushed a mop across these polished floors, while teenagers laughed at her behind her back, and well-dressed customers stepped around her like she was a wet floor sign that had learned to breathe. An hour earlier, she'd taken a call from the hospital telling her that her mother needed another round of dialysis she couldn't afford, and she'd swallowed the tears and gone back to work, because that's what she always did. So when Rufus Hale grabbed her from behind and pressed the cold muzzle of a pistol against her temple, dragging her backward toward the shuttered jewelry kiosk, he thought he'd picked the safest possible hostage. He'd chosen her because she was closest, because she looked weak, because he was certain no one on earth would risk a single thing for a poor, overweight cleaning lady that the whole world had already decided was invisible. He had no idea he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. He didn't know that the faint crescent-shaped birthmark hidden beneath her collar, and the broken silver pendant shaped like a swallow, with one missing wing that hung against her chest, were the only 2 clues a very dangerous man had been hunting for 22 long years. And he certainly didn't know that man was about to walk through the north entrance. Dresden Kovac was 37, dressed in a charcoal coat that cost more than Maëlle earned in a year, and he moved through the dark mall the way a king moves through a country he silently owns. Half the businesses in this district paid quiet respects to his name. Hardened men lowered their eyes when he passed. He'd buried a great deal of his humanity a long time ago, on the night his parents were murdered, and his 5-year-old sister vanished without a trace. And for 2 decades he'd searched every city, every record, every shadow, for a little girl with a crescent birthmark and a swallow that had lost its wing. He came to the Galleria that night to inspect a property. He didn't come expecting to find the one thing he'd stopped believing he would ever find. And as he stepped into that silent atrium and saw a desperate man holding a gun to a trembling janitor's head, the overhead light caught the back of her neck, and the entire architecture of his cold, careful world cracked straight down the middle, because the woman everyone in that building had spent years ignoring, mocking, and looking right through. The woman a small-time criminal had just decided was worthless enough to die, was the most important person in the world to the most powerful man in the city. And not one single person in that mall, not the gunman, not the bystanders, not even Maëlle herself, had any idea who she really was. If a story about the people we wrongly overlook moves something in you, do us a favor and tap that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that no human being is ever truly invisible. And subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this one are exactly why you're here. Now let's step back into that silent mall, into the breath before everything changed, and watch how the night truly began. 20 minutes before the gunfire cracked the night wide open, Crestline Galleria was nothing more than a vast, echoing emptiness. A place where the ceiling lights had been dimmed by half, and the cold glass doors reflected the solitary figure of a woman pushing a mop across the deserted food court. Maëlle Fontaine worked in a silence most people would have found suffocating. But to her, that quiet was the easiest part of the day to breathe through, because once everyone had gone home, no one was left to look at her with pity or contempt. No one stepped around her as though she were a dirty puddle they had to avoid. Her shoes were frayed at the edges. The sole on the left one split open along a thin crack she had temporarily stuffed with a piece of cardboard cut from a box. And with every step, a faint chill seeped up from the polished tile floor into the bottom of her foot, but she didn't pay attention to it anymore. Because there are small pains people learn to carry until they forget they're hurting at all. In the pocket of her oversized uniform shirt, her old phone with the cracked screen lay still, and she knew that inside it was a message she hadn't dared to open again. A message from the hospital about the amount due for her mother's next dialysis treatment, a number larger than 2 full weeks of her wages put together. Maëlle worked 2 shifts, the day shift at a laundromat 4 blocks away, then the night shift at this shopping mall, and between the 2, she only managed to doze for about 4 hours on the old sofa in the one-room apartment she shared with her mother. Her dinner tonight was still the cold lunchbox she had brought from home, a few pieces of chicken left from the day before, and a little white rice that had dried out, and she had eaten it quickly in the cramped employee break room at the start of her shift, chewing slowly not because it tasted good, but because she had grown used to stretching every bite, so the feeling of fullness would last a little longer. Some nights, she would stand leaning against her mop and look out across the vast atrium of the mall, watching the brightly lit stores display handbags and expensive watches behind glass, and she would wonder what life felt like for the people who could buy such things, not with envy, but with a distant curiosity, like someone standing on the ground and looking up at a star she knew she would never touch. But Maëlle never allowed herself to sink too long into those thoughts, because she understood that self-pity was a luxury someone like her couldn't afford, and every time bitterness rose in her throat, she thought of her mother, of the gaunt hollows in her face after every dialysis session, of the way she tried to smile and tell her not to worry, and Maëlle would swallow the tightness in her chest and keep pushing the mop in steady circles across the tile floor. Her dignity wasn't in her faded uniform or her torn shoes. It was in the fact that she had never let poverty turn her cruel, had never poured her exhaustion onto anyone else, and still nodded politely in greeting even to people who had never once bothered to look at her. Tonight, she cleaned more carefully than usual around the tables stained with dried ketchup, bending low to scrub away each stubborn mark, her back aching and sweat gathering beneath her shirt. But she worked with the careful devotion of someone who believed that no matter how small the job was, doing it decently was still the way she held on to the last piece of her self-respect. The clock on the wall was nearing 11 o'clock. Her shift was almost over, and she had already begun thinking about the ride home on the last bus, thinking about having to wake up early the next morning to call the hospital and ask to pay the bill in installments, thinking about all the familiar burdens waiting for her out there, without knowing that in only a few more minutes, this night, which had seemed ordinary to the point of despair, would become the night that changed her entire life. The quiet Maëlle treasured was broken by a burst of shrill laughter echoing from the walkway near the fashion stores, where a group of 4 or 5 young people, in expensive clothes, was still lingering even though the mall was about to close, their hands carrying paper bags printed with the logos of brands she only dared to look at through glass. They had just walked out of the mall's late-night movie theater and past the place she had just finished mopping, and one young man in the group deliberately stepped his spotless white sneakers into the still wet patch of floor, leaving a long, dirty streak behind, then turned to look at her with a smirk. She quietly pulled the mop back, bent down, and cleaned the spot he had just stained without saying a word, and that very silence, so patient and resigned, seemed only to amuse the young people even more. A blonde girl in the group curled her lip and made a comment about Maëlle's body, loud enough for her to hear, saying that someone as fat as her should eat less instead of mopping floors, and all of them burst out laughing as though it were the funniest thing in the world. Another young man pretended to wonder aloud why a luxury mall like this would let someone as shabby-looking as her work there, ruining the whole atmosphere. Maëlle kept her head lowered, both hands gripping the mop handle until her knuckles turned white, and she let those words slide over her the way she had done hundreds of times before, because she understood that answering back would only make things worse, and that with people like them, her hurt was exactly the reward they were looking for. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, only felt a familiar dull weight inside her chest. The feeling of a person slowly beginning to believe she truly was invisible, that in other people's eyes, she existed only as an object that could move, present to clean up the messes they left behind, then quietly disappear when the work was done. She told herself that in just a few more minutes, they would get bored and leave, and she would have her silence back again. But at that exact moment, a sharp, clear voice rang out from behind the young people. Priscilla Vance, the night shift manager whom everyone affectionately called Prue, a woman of about 50 with neatly cropped salt and pepper hair, walked over with a calm expression, though her eyes held no trace of mercy, and she told the group to behave properly, or leave the mall immediately, because closing time had come. The young man leading the group started to argue, asking in an arrogant voice who she was to speak to him like that. But Prue only looked him straight in the eye and said she was the person responsible for this area, and that the woman they were mocking worked harder and with more decency than any of them, and that expensive clothes couldn't buy human character. Perhaps because of the certainty in her voice, or perhaps because they realized their little game was over, the young people muttered a few words and walked away, leaving their laughter to fade thinly down the empty corridor. Prue stepped closer to Maëlle, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was all right in the gentle voice of someone who truly cared, not someone asking out of habit. Maëlle looked up, forced a tired smile, and answered that she was fine, that she was used to it, and those 3 words, used to it, made a shadow of sadness pass across Prue's face, because she understood that no one should ever have to get used to being treated that way. Prue told her never to believe those cruel words, that a person's worth wasn't found in their appearance or the work they did, and that she saw in Maëlle a heart many of those finely dressed people would never possess in their entire lives. Maëlle gave a small nod, a quiet gratitude rising inside her for the only woman in this building who treated her like a human being, and she thanked her in a soft voice before turning back to the work still left unfinished, never knowing that in only a few more minutes, the rare kindness of this night would be swallowed by an event no one could have foreseen. A few dozen yards away, tucked behind a row of concrete columns near the east emergency exit, a man named Rufus Hale stood motionless in the dark, the back of his jacket soaked through with sweat even though the night had a chill in it, and he was counting each beat of his own heart, trying to keep his hands from shaking. He was 40 years old, his face gaunt and marked by the deep lines of a man who had spent too many years living inside fear, and beneath his old jacket was a handgun he had borrowed from a man he knew in the underworld, a gun he had never truly wanted to have to use. Many years earlier, Rufus had worked as a low-level errand man for a small gang that collected debts for hire and moved contraband, a disposable pawn who ran errands and took loose change to do the filthy jobs other people didn't want to touch, and he had never risen any higher because he lacked the cold-blooded cruelty that world demanded. Then his gang fell apart after a purge, leaving him stranded with a mountain of debt and creditors who had no mercy in them, men who had given him exactly 1 week to repay money he had no way of earning, along with a clear warning about what would happen to him if he didn't pay. Tonight was the final night of that deadline, and Rufus had reached the very end of despair, the kind of despair that drives a man who isn't truly evil into calculating things he would never dare to think about on an ordinary day. He had watched Crestline Galleria for several days, had memorized its closing time, had noticed that at the end of the night shift, all the cash collected during the day was brought to the safe in the management office behind the central cashier area before the armored car arrived to pick it up the next morning, and he had told himself that if he could just get that money, it would be enough to pay his debt and disappear from this city forever. The plan in his head was almost childishly simple. Slip in when the mall was nearly empty, overpower the manager who held the keys to the secure room, take the money, then get out through the emergency exit before anyone had time to react. No need to hurt anyone. No need to fire a single shot. Just the gun to frighten people enough. He repeated that to himself again and again like a prayer. No need to hurt anyone, because somewhere deep inside him, a scrap of conscience was still struggling against what he was about to do, and that very struggle made the sweat pour harder from his body and his breathing grow more ragged. He thought about the shabby rented room where he was living, thought about the threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, thought about the way life had pushed him into a corner, little by little, until he could no longer see any way out except this one, and he tried to convince himself that he had no choice, though some part of him knew perfectly well that was only a lie he was telling himself to quiet his fear. When the laughter of the rich young people faded away and the last footsteps left the main hall, when the lights were dimmed another notch and the mall sank into the silence of day's end, Rufus understood that the moment had come, that if he hesitated any longer, he would lose all his courage and run, and then by morning, the creditors would come looking for him. He drew in a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead with one hand, pulled the brim of his baseball cap low to hide more of his face, then placed his trembling hand on the grip of the gun hidden inside his jacket, and stepped out from the shadows of the columns, moving toward the central cashier area with the heavy steps of a man rushing toward a mistake he would never be able to take back, completely unaware that in just a few more minutes, every clumsy calculation he had made would collapse in a way he couldn't possibly imagine. Things didn't unfold the way Rufus had calculated from the very first step. He had cornered the night manager, Prue, right outside the office, demanding the vault keys. But Prue fiercely refused, shouting that she didn't have access. Panic surged inside his chest as he heard security guards approaching from the corridor, leaving him standing exposed with his plan falling apart around him. Panic surged inside his chest, his heart pounding hard, and in that frantic moment, when he turned around, he caught sight of a woman in a janitor's uniform, standing not far away, a mop in her hand, her eyes wide as she looked at him. It was Maëlle, who had just pushed her cleaning cart around the hidden corner and accidentally witnessed the shape of a strange man with a gun showing beneath the flap of his coat. In his desperation, the first thought that flashed through Rufus's mind was that he needed a hostage, a shield, someone he could control, so he could force the security guards to open the safe, or at least give himself a way to escape, and his gaze swept over the woman in front of him and made a quick, mistaken judgment. He chose her because she was closest, because she looked weak and harmless, because in his mind, a heavy woman who cleaned floors for a living would be obediently terrified, and no one in this world would risk their life for someone like her. So he rushed forward, grabbed her, hooked one arm around her neck, and pressed the freezing muzzle of the gun against her temple. What Rufus had absolutely no way of knowing was that in that fateful instant, he'd just made 3 fatal mistakes at once. The first mistake was that he'd chosen to commit a crime in the very heart of a territory the entire underworld of this city quietly understood to be under the control of an organization he didn't dare name. The second mistake was that he'd chosen the exact night when the head of that organization was about to step into that very place for private reasons of his own. And the third mistake, the most terrible mistake of all, whose full weight he wouldn't understand until much later, was that he'd pressed a gun to the head of a person whom, if that underworld ever learned her true identity, it would be willing to spill blood across the whole city to protect, even though the woman herself didn't have the slightest idea who she was. But what unsettled Rufus at once, what made him feel that something was strangely wrong, was the reaction of the hostage in his arms. Maëlle didn't scream, didn't struggle, didn't beg in panic the way he'd imagined every hostage would. She only stood still, her breathing quick but steady, her body tense but not shaking violently. And that unusual calm made even the man holding the gun feel a chill crawl over him. She was calm, not because she'd been trained to face danger, not because she carried some secret physical strength, but for a far simpler and much more heartbreaking reason, because she'd grown far too used to enduring. A person who'd spent years carrying poverty, contempt, the fear of her mother's hospital bills, and long nights of exhaustion on her shoulders. A person who'd learned to swallow her tears and keep walking day after day, eventually reached a point where fear itself wore thin, hardened over, and death no longer seemed as terrifying as it did to people who still had so much left to lose. In that moment, with a gun pressed to her head, Maëlle didn't think of herself first. She only felt a deep weariness and a strange calm rising inside her, the calm of someone too tired to have enough strength left for panic, and she closed her eyes for one brief instant, then opened them again, silently waiting to see what fate would decide next for a life that had already known far too much bitterness. Rufus tightened his arm around Maëlle's neck and began dragging her backward toward the closed jewelry counter in the corner of the hall, where the metal security shutter had been pulled halfway down and the glass display cases inside were now only dim, shadowy shapes. He chose that place by instinct because it was tucked into a corner, with his back against the wall so no one could come at him from behind. His steps staggered with tension, and each time he jerked hard, Maëlle's body was dragged along with him, her torn shoes sliding across the polished tile floor. But she tried to keep her balance and move with his rhythm so she wouldn't fall, because she understood that in his agitated state, one sudden movement could make the finger tightening around the trigger jerk in an instant. Panicked cries began ringing through the hall as a few store employees who had stayed late and several night shift security guards discovered the horrifying scene. Someone shouted for someone to call the police. Someone hurriedly ducked behind a counter. A paper cup fell to the ground and rolled away, and from a distance Prue ran forward a few steps before freezing in place, one hand covering her mouth, her face turning white when she realized the person with a gun pressed to her head was Maëlle. Rufus shouted for everyone to back up, his voice cracking more from fear than aggression, and that very instability in his voice made the air even more dangerous, because a panicked man with a gun is far more unpredictable than a cold-blooded man with a plan. He pressed Maëlle's back tightly against his chest like a shield, and she could feel his heart hammering through the layers of clothing, could feel his ragged breath against the back of her neck, could even feel the trembling in the arm locked around her throat. And strangely, those things didn't make her more afraid. They only made her realize that this man, too, was desperate in his own way. But on that fragile line between life and death, the thought that took over Maëlle's mind wasn't fear for herself, but the image of her mother's face. She thought of her mother waiting in their small apartment, that frail woman barely surviving on dialysis sessions that only Maëlle's wages could struggle to pay for, and a chilling question suddenly pierced through her heart. If she died here tonight, who would take care of her mother? Who would take her to the hospital on Monday morning? Who would sit beside her and hold her thin hand and tell her everything was going to be all right? That thought was what made her eyes burn, not the gun barrel against her temple, not death hovering so close, but the fear that her leaving would abandon her mother with no one to lean on, and for the first time since she'd been seized, she felt her heart twist with something stronger than the instinct to survive, and that was love and responsibility. Her lips moved faintly in a silent prayer, not asking to be spared, but asking that her mother be safe no matter what happened. And though her eyes shimmered with tears, she didn't let a single one fall, because even in this final, unbearable moment, she still wouldn't allow herself to collapse. Rufus felt the strange stillness of the hostage in his arms, and it only confused him more. He glanced around the hall, where terrified eyes were fixed on him, and he knew he'd fallen into a situation with no way out. And while he was still floundering, unsure what to do next, a figure quietly stepped in from the mall's northern entrance, bringing with him a presence that seemed to make the entire hall sink lower under its weight. The man who had just stepped through the northern entrance was Dresden Kovac, and his arrival changed the atmosphere in the hall in a way even the people already drowning in panic couldn't explain. He had come to the mall tonight with Greer, his quietest and most trusted right-hand man, only to inspect a property his organization had recently taken over in this area. Nothing more and nothing less than a routine visit, and he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat, walking at an unhurried pace with the bearing of a man who'd never had to rush for anything in his life. The moment he entered the main hall and took in the scene before him, a man pressing a gun to a woman's head in the middle of a terrified crowd, he didn't stop short in surprise the way an ordinary person would have. He only slowed to a halt, his dark eyes sweeping over the entire scene with the frightening composure of someone who had known violence for so long that it no longer had the power to shake him. Greer immediately moved half a step forward, one hand already slipping inside his coat where his weapon was hidden. But Dresden merely lifted 2 fingers in a faint signal for him to stop, and that small gesture was enough to make Greer stand absolutely still, because in their world, Dresden's orders were obeyed not only through words, but through the slightest motion of his hand. The strangest thing, the thing Rufus began to vaguely sense, even though he didn't yet understand why, was the way the people around them reacted to the presence of this newly arrived man. The 2 night shift security guards, who had been cowering behind the counter, recognized Dresden and immediately lowered their heads, stepping aside to give him room, and not a single person dared to move closer or ask a question, as though somewhere in their instincts they understood that this was not a man they had any right to challenge. A store manager who had stayed late, after catching only a glimpse of Dresden's face, turned pale and hurriedly pulled his employees deeper inside, whispering something Maëlle couldn't hear clearly, but the sound of it carried the weight of fear and respect. Even Prue, who only moments earlier had been brave enough to stand up for Maëlle against those young people, now stood frozen, her eyes shifting from the gun to the man in the overcoat with a look that was both bewildered and cautious, because although she didn't know exactly who he was, the instincts of a woman who had worked in this area for many years told her this was someone people shouldn't cross. The atmosphere in the hall, which had been thick with chaotic fear, suddenly sank in a strange way. The noisy panic gave way to a heavier, far more tense silence, the silence of people who could feel that the balance of power in the room had just shifted before they had time to understand why. Dresden stood there, both hands still hanging relaxed at his sides, his face showing no trace of emotion, and he quietly studied the gunman trembling behind his hostage, reading every clumsy movement, every bead of sweat on his forehead, every sign of desperation and inexperience, with the coldness of a man weighing how to deal with an unwanted inconvenience that had appeared in his path. To Dresden, in that moment, this was simply a reckless, petty criminal who had chosen the wrong place to cause trouble, a situation he could resolve cleanly, and his gaze passed over the woman being held hostage, as though passing over one detail in the larger picture, not stopping, not recognizing anything at all. He hadn't yet seen her face completely, hadn't paid attention to her as a specific human being, and saw only a random victim in an incident he was about to step into. And with the lethal calm of a man who held the power of life and death in his hands, Dresden tilted his head slightly and began walking toward the corner of the hall where Rufus had trapped his hostage against the wall, completely unaware that within the next few seconds, the solid world he had spent so many years building was about to crack open. Dresden had only taken a few steps when Rufus, in his panic, jerked the hostage hard and twisted his body so he could keep that living shield between himself and the man approaching him. And that sudden movement was what made Maëlle turn slightly to one side, exposing the back of her neck and the line of her shoulder beneath the beam of a ceiling light still glowing above the jewelry counter. In that instant, the light swept across the collar of her uniform, which had slipped lower, and Dresden, standing only a few steps away, accidentally saw the thing he had been searching for through every dream and every nightmare for the past 22 years. The faint crescent-shaped birthmark on the back of her neck and the familiar glint of the broken silver pendant. His stride stopped halfway, so abruptly that even Greer behind him realized something had changed, and Dresden's entire body seemed to turn to stone, his eyes pinned to one small spot on the back of that woman's neck with absolute focus, a kind of focus no threat in his life had ever forced out of him before. For all those years, he had buried almost every emotion beneath layer after layer of ice, had forged himself into a coldness so complete that people whispered his heart had died long ago, and sometimes even he believed it, believed that the softer human part of him had been burned away on that horrifying night years before. And yet now, in a single heartbeat, all those layers of ice split open, and an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to touch for 2 decades surged up and lodged in his chest, stealing his breath and making his fingertips tremble in a way even he couldn't control. He saw it, that mark he had carved into his memory since it had once rested on the skin of a 5-year-old little girl, and beside it, half hidden near her collar, was the familiar glint of metal from an object he'd thought had been lost forever, along with the person he loved most in the world. In that one brief second, 22 years of hopeless searching, 22 years of hunting through every city, 22 years of paying investigators only to receive one disappointment after another, 22 years of tormenting himself because he hadn't protected what mattered most, all of it compressed and shattered inside his mind at once. And then, for the first time in a very long time, Dresden Kovac felt something he'd thought he had forgotten how to feel. Fear. Not fear of the gun, not fear for his own life, because those things had never shaken him, but a fear so numbing it reached into the marrow of his bones. The fear that the thing he had finally found after all those years could vanish right before his eyes, with one pull of the trigger by the trembling man holding her. His entire life, he had been used to controlling every situation, used to the feeling that every piece on the board rested within his grasp. And yet now he stood helpless before something he couldn't rush, couldn't force, couldn't act on recklessly, because even the smallest mistake could take from him the one thing all his fortune and power could never buy back. And still, even as the whole world inside him was collapsing and screaming, Dresden's face did not change on the outside. It remained cold and smooth as the surface of a frozen lake, because he understood that now, more than ever, he couldn't reveal even the faintest flicker of emotion, couldn't let the gunman or anyone else in that hall guess how much the woman they saw as ordinary truly meant to him. And Maëlle, still standing there with her eyes half closed and the gun pressed against her temple, had absolutely no idea what had just happened inside the stranger, only a few steps away from her. Dresden drew in a very quiet breath, forcing the entire storm screaming inside his chest down beneath the familiar shell of calm, then began walking closer at a slow pace, both hands still visible in Rufus's line of sight so the man wouldn't panic and do something reckless. And when Dresden spoke, his voice came out low, even, and cold as tempered steel, the kind of voice that wasn't loud at all, yet made the entire hall fall utterly silent. He didn't shout, didn't issue orders, didn't threaten in the usual way. He only said with quiet composure that the man was in a far worse situation than he realized, and that if he was willing to listen, there might still be a way out. Rufus, already stretched tight as a wire, stammered out a shout telling him to stay where he was, but Dresden only tilted his head slightly and studied him with dark eyes that didn't waver at all. And then he began saying things that made Rufus go still. He said the man wasn't a professional, and that it showed clearly in the way he held the gun, in his sweat-soaked hands, in the fact that he had chosen to rob a mall at the exact hour when the safe had already been sealed, a mistake no experienced man would ever make. He went on, his voice still as steady as though he were talking about the weather, saying that Rufus owed money he couldn't repay, that the people he owed weren't the patient kind, and that the deadline they had given him was probably tonight or tomorrow morning, which was why he had become desperate enough to do something this reckless. Every sentence Dresden spoke was like a knife driven straight into Rufus's hidden despair, and a chill ran down the man's spine when he realized this stranger seemed to see through his entire life in only a few words, reading even the things he'd never told anyone. Dresden wasn't guessing blindly. He was reasoning from each small detail with the sharpness of a man who had spent his whole life in the underworld. He had recognized the faded tattoo on Rufus's wrist as belonging to a small gang that had been purged not long ago. And from there he pieced together the whole story. A disposable pawn abandoned after the organization collapsed, left carrying debts, and hunted by the very men who had once been his own people. He said it calmly, saying that the very people Rufus used to serve were now the ones who wanted his life, and that Rufus was trying to solve a large problem with a stupid act that would only drag him deeper into the mire. Rufus trembled as he asked who Dresden really was to know so much. But Dresden didn't answer that question. He hadn't revealed his identity, because he understood that information and composure were the most powerful weapons in this situation, and that the longer Rufus remained confused about who he was facing, the more control Dresden would hold. He controlled the entire exchange not with force, but with the authority of a man who always knew more than his opponent, and every word he spoke was carefully measured to peel away Rufus's layer of aggression, exposing beneath it a frightened, cornered human being. Throughout that tense exchange, Dresden's eyes occasionally passed over Mael's face, but he forced each glance to be brief, casual, and accidental, never letting it linger long enough for anyone to notice, though inside him, every time he looked at her, his heart tightened. He told Rufus, in a voice still cold as ice, that there was still a path for him to walk out of this place without paying for it with his life, that he only had to put down the gun and let the woman go, and that if he was wise enough to listen, perhaps tonight wouldn't end in the worst possible way, while in truth, hidden behind every calm word of negotiation, there was a man gathering every ounce of willpower he had to keep himself from lunging forward and crushing the one who had dared to touch his sister. In the middle of the negotiation, stretched tight as a wire about to snap, it was Mael herself who broke the silence, and what she said took both Dresden and Rufus by surprise. In a voice that was soft yet strangely clear, she spoke not to beg for her own life, but to plead for the others. She told Rufus that whatever he did to her was fine, but please, let the people hiding behind those counters leave safely, because they were only innocent employees who were frightened and had nothing to do with his trouble. Then her eyes searched for Prue, the older woman standing frozen in place with a bloodless face, and Mael said gently that he should please not hurt her, that she was a good person, that if he needed a hostage, Mael was enough, and he didn't need anyone else. In a moment when most people would have been able to think only of themselves, Mael used what might have been her final plea to ask for the safety of other people, and that kindness wasn't a performance meant to win over her captor. It flowed naturally from the very core of who she was, from a heart that all those years of hardship still hadn't managed to harden or make selfish. Standing only a few steps away, Dresden witnessed all of it, and every word she spoke twisted like a blade into the deepest place inside him. He looked at the woman in the faded janitor's uniform, with her torn shoes and the body the outside world had mocked, the woman who had a gun pressed to her head and still thought first about protecting others, and a silent pain rose up and closed around his chest until he could hardly breathe. He thought about the life she must have lived, a life of poverty, hard labor, and being looked down on, a life that should have been entirely different if that fateful night years ago hadn't happened, if he hadn't lost her. And the thought that the person he should have protected all these years had been forced to struggle that much made him ache with grief and burn with a cold fury toward everything that had driven her life to this point. But more painful than that sorrow was the choked, overwhelming admiration he felt when he realized that no matter how cruel life had been to her, she had kept something he himself had lost long ago: kindness, the ability to think of others even while standing at the edge of the abyss. He, the man who had built an entire empire on ruthlessness and the fear he spread, stood there looking at the woman who carried the same blood as his own, watching her give off a gentle light that all his power and money could never create, and in that moment he felt both immeasurably proud and unbearably ashamed. He had to use every ounce of restraint he possessed not to step forward at once, not to drop to his knees in front of her, not to speak the truth lodged painfully in his throat, because he understood this wasn't the time. That one careless word now could make the panicked man holding her pull the trigger in a burst of agitation. So he swallowed everything down, kept his face as cold and expressionless as before, and only his eyes betrayed him for a fleeting instant, shining with an emotion that, mercifully, no one in the hall had time to notice. And Mael, after speaking those words of mercy for other people, quietly lowered her head again and waited, having absolutely no idea that the strange man standing before her had heard those words with a heart that was breaking for her. Something began gnawing at Rufus's mind, an instinct growing clearer by the second that he'd stepped into waters far deeper than he had ever imagined. He glanced around the hall, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. The security guards weren't moving toward him. They stood pressed near the walls, eyes lowered, not because they were afraid of his gun, but because they were afraid of the man in the overcoat. The store manager had vanished after seeing that man's face. Even the older woman who had dared to step forward only moments ago now stood silent. No one was calling the police anymore. No one dared to move. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the command of one single person, and that person wasn't him, the man holding the gun. That wasn't normal. A man with a gun was supposed to be the one in control, and yet all the frightened eyes in the hall were not fixed on Rufus. They were fixed on the other man. Rufus felt cold sweat running down his spine. He didn't know who this man was, but he had lived long enough in the underworld to recognize the bearing of someone truly dangerous. The kind of danger that didn't need to shout, didn't need to brandish a weapon in his hand, but radiated from his absolute calm. The most frightening men Rufus had ever met all had eyes like that, the eyes of someone used to ordering death without even blinking. And the way this man had read Rufus's life so clearly, knowing about the debt, knowing about his old gang, could mean only one thing. Rufus was standing before someone with far more power than he had imagined. A horrifying thought flashed through his mind, that perhaps this very area, this very mall, was under that man's control, and that Rufus had accidentally stepped onto the territory of someone he never should have touched. That fear didn't calm him down. Instead, it drove him deeper into panic. His heart pounded wildly. The hand holding the gun shook harder. His breathing became quick and broken. He felt the whole world closing tight around him, every escape route slamming shut, and in the very depths of desperation, he did what cornered men always do. He tightened his arm even more around Maëlle's neck and pressed the muzzle harder against her temple, as though clinging to his hostage was the only way he could hold on to the last small scrap of power he had left. He shouted, his voice shattered and warped, telling the other man to back away, telling everyone to stay far from him, saying he had nothing to lose. And that statement was the most terrifying thing of all, because a man who believes he has nothing left to lose can do anything. Maëlle let out a faint moan because the arm around her throat had tightened so hard she couldn't breathe. And that small sound was like a spark flaring in the dark. Dresden, who until now had maintained a mask of absolute calm, narrowed his eyes slightly, and for the first time since entering the hall, something truly dangerous flickered in their depths. The air in the hall stretched so tight, it seemed even the faintest sound would be enough to make everything explode, and every person in the room could feel that the decisive moment was drawing very near. In that suffocating stillness, Greer leaned slightly toward Dresden, lowered his voice, and whispered something only the two of them could hear. Greer's whisper was very soft, but in the suffocating stillness of the hall, it still carried an invisible weight. He leaned close to Dresden and asked whether it was time to let this man know who he was facing. And after a brief silence, Dresden gave a faint nod. He took one more step toward Rufus, his eyes never leaving him, then spoke, still in that deep and steady voice, saying it was time the man understood exactly what he was pointing a gun at, and then he said his name. He didn't force the words, didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke the two words Dresden Kovac, with the calmness of someone stating the obvious, but those two words fell into the tense air like a stone thrown onto the surface of a frozen lake, and the reaction of everyone around them said more than any threat ever could. One of the two security guards drew in a sharp breath. Prue lifted a hand to cover her mouth. And most important of all, Rufus was the one who took the full weight of that name. For one moment, his face froze, his eyes widened, and all the blood seemed to drain from his face, leaving behind the ash-gray color of absolute terror. Because Rufus knew that name. Every man who had ever set foot in this city's underworld knew that name. It was the name people only dared to mention in whispers. The name tied to rumors of men who vanished without a trace. Of an underground empire stretching across the harbor district that no one dared to challenge. The name of the man standing at the very top of the world, where Rufus had once been nothing more than a small, disposable pawn. And now he realized, with a late and terrible clarity, that he hadn't merely broken into the wrong place, hadn't merely angered some nameless powerful figure, but that he was pressing a gun to a hostage's head right in front of the most powerful, most frightening, and most ruthless man he could ever have imagined. The entire balance of power in the hall, which had seemed to belong to the man holding the gun, had been completely reversed by a single name. True power in this room had never belonged to Rufus. It had always belonged to the man standing across from him with empty hands, and now Rufus understood that. His legs began to tremble, the gun in his hand wavered, and he stammered, his voice stripped of all the aggression it had carried moments earlier, asking why someone like Dresden was here, why someone like him would care about a petty robbery and a hostage who was no one at all. Dresden didn't answer at once, and his silence was more frightening than any answer could have been, because inside Rufus's mind, possibilities began spinning wildly. He tried to understand what he had accidentally become tangled in, what he had touched that belonged to this man without even knowing it. By the instinct of a drowning man grabbing at a post, he tightened his hold on the hostage, as though Maëlle were the only bargaining chip he had left, the only guarantee that might keep him alive for a few more minutes. But that very act only made Dresden's eyes darken with greater danger, because Rufus had no idea that each time he tightened his arm around that woman's throat, he was testing the last fragile thread of restraint in a brother who had just found his lost little sister again, after 22 years. The air in the hall grew thick and heavy, and everyone could feel that the balance had tilted completely to one side, that the man with the gun was now only a cornered animal pressed against the wall, and that in the few brief seconds ahead, everything would be decided one way or another, while Maëlle, still trapped in the trembling arms of her captor, could only dimly sense that, for some reason, she couldn't possibly understand. The strange man before her seemed to be looking at her not as though she were a stranger. Everything broke open in a single instant. Rufus, driven to the very edge of despair, felt every escape route slam shut around him, and in a mindless rush of panic, he made the worst decision of his life. He pulled the muzzle away from Maëlle's temple and aimed it straight at Dresden, his finger tightening on the trigger in a convulsion of fear. But Dresden had been waiting for precisely that second. The very moment the barrel left his sister's head, he moved. The gunshot tore through the air, but the bullet flew off course, because Dresden had reached him in that split second, one hand striking Rufus's wrist hard and driving it upward toward the ceiling, and the bullet punched into the advertising sign above the jewelry counter, shattering a section of glass that came raining down with a sharp, glittering crash. Everything after that happened so fast that the people watching could barely follow it. Dresden locked Rufus's gun hand, twisted his wrist outward with a force that was decisive and merciless, making the man scream in pain as his fingers were forced open. The gun dropped to the floor and skidded away. At the same time, Dresden slammed his shoulder into Rufus's chest, knocking him away from Maëlle, and she stumbled forward, only to be caught by Greer's hands as he stepped in just in time. Rufus hadn't even recovered his senses before Dresden seized him by the collar, yanked him hard, and drove his whole body down onto the cold tile floor. The man fell face down, his cheek pressed against the ground, one arm wrenched behind his back, and pinned there by Dresden's knee pressing into the center of his spine. All of it happened in only a few seconds. Not one wasted movement, not one instant of hesitation. The cold mastery in every motion Dresden made showed that this was a man far too familiar with violence, a man for whom subduing another person was little more than instinct. Rufus lay flattened against the floor, gasping, his wrist burning with pain, moaning something no one could understand, every trace of resistance in him completely broken. The echo of the gunshot still rang through the hall, and it took a while before the people hiding behind the counters dared to open their eyes and look out, only to witness a sight that left them stunned. The man who moments earlier had seemed to hold life and death in his hands was now lying helpless beneath the feet of the man in the overcoat, utterly powerless. Greer kept Maëlle steady, and she lifted a trembling hand to her throat, where Rufus's arm had left a raw, burning ache, coughing dryly a few times as she fought to pull air back into her lungs. But aside from a few bruises and the shock of the fall, she wasn't badly hurt. She was still alive. In her daze, she looked up at the man who had just saved her, and found Dresden looking at her too, for the briefest instant. Yet there was something so fierce in his eyes that her heart seemed to sink softly inside her chest, even though she couldn't begin to understand why. Then he turned away at once, hiding his emotion, and forced all his cold attention back onto the man lying beneath him. He bent close to Rufus's ear, and said something too quietly for anyone else to hear, and though no one knew what he said, they saw Rufus's whole body jerk, then go slack, the last of his hope dying out in his eyes. Greer drew his own gun, not to fire, but with a cold readiness, his gaze fixed on Dresden as he waited for an order, and the entire hall fell into a new silence, a silence even more tense than the one after the gunshot. because now the fate of the man on the floor rested entirely in the hands of the man he had been foolish enough to anger. And no one in that room knew how Dresden would decide it. Greer stood there with the gun in his hand, his calm eyes fixed on Dresden, waiting for that familiar nod, that wordless command that over all these years had decided the fate of countless men who had dared to stand in the organization's way, by the ordinary rules of the world they belonged to. The ending for someone like Rufus had already been written. A man who had dared press a gun to a hostage inside Dresden Kovac's territory, who had dared fire a shot in his direction, had no reason to be allowed to keep living, and all it would take was one slight lift of Dresden's chin for everything to end right here, cleanly and without a trace, the way similar problems had always been handled. Dresden still had his knee pressed into Rufus's back, and for one moment, the rage inside him rose with such force that he truly wanted to do it, wanted to punish to the fullest the man who had dared touch his sister, who had dared press a gun barrel to the temple of the person Dresden had spent 2 decades searching for in despair. His hand tightened, every fiber of his body screaming for revenge, and Greer, reading that rare hesitation, lifted the gun slightly as if silently asking whether Dresden needed him to do it instead. But then Dresden raised his head, and his eyes accidentally met Maëlle's. She stood only a few steps away, still trembling after the shock, her eyes wide as she stared at the scene before her with fear and confusion. And in those eyes, he saw the innocence of a person who had never belonged to his dark world, a person who still believed in goodness, a person who only moments earlier had been pleading for other people's lives. And the moment he met that gaze, Dresden's rage suddenly halted. He realized that if he acted now, if he let her watch him coldly end a human life right in front of her, then the first image his lost sister would carry of him would be the image of a cold-blooded killer. He had lost her for 22 years, and now that he had only just found her again, he couldn't bear the thought that the first thing she learned about him would be his brutality. There were things even a man as familiar with blood and violence as he was still wouldn't trade away, and the clear, unguarded eyes of that woman were one of them. So Dresden slowly loosened his hand, and in a deep, controlled voice, he ordered Greer to put the gun away. Greer looked briefly surprised but didn't question him, obeying at once, because Dresden's orders were absolute. Dresden bent down and told Rufus that he wouldn't die tonight, but that he would never again walk free as though nothing had happened, that the organization would deal with him in its own way, according to the rules of the underworld, a punishment that wouldn't spill blood in a public place, but would still be enough to make him pay for what he had done. Dresden signaled, and at once, 2 men from the organization entered from the northern doors, silently hauled the limp Rufus to his feet, and escorted him away into the shadows, leaving him to face a kind of justice beyond the reach of ordinary law. As he was taken away, Rufus no longer resisted. He only looked back at the woman he had chosen as his hostage with an unreadable expression, as though even at that final moment he still couldn't understand how an ordinary janitor could make his entire world collapse. And then he disappeared behind the door, leaving Dresden standing in the hall, now quiet again, facing the woman for whom, for the first time in his life, he had chosen to let go of cruelty. As the hall slowly returned to quiet and the people hiding behind the counters began timidly stepping out, Dresden should have been able to turn on his heel and leave the way he always did after dealing with an inconvenience, leaving the employees to clean up and letting the story drift into oblivion. But he couldn't. His feet seemed nailed to the tile floor, and his entire being was held in place by the presence of the woman standing only a few steps away from him. He couldn't walk away when the thing he had been searching for through 22 years was finally right before his eyes, close enough that he only had to reach out to touch it. Greer, understanding that something unusual was happening to the man he served, quietly signaled for everyone to keep their distance and move back, creating a private space for Dresden in the middle of the vast hall. Dresden slowly approached Maëlle, and this time, he no longer carried the terrifying coldness he'd worn while facing Rufus. Each step he took was strangely cautious, as though he were afraid one movement made too quickly might cause the figure before him to vanish. Maëlle, still shaken by everything that had just happened, instinctively stepped back half a pace as that powerful man came closer, because although he had just saved her life, she could still feel the dark power radiating from him, and she didn't understand why someone like him would care about her. He stopped at a distance, just far enough not to frighten her further, and when he spoke, his voice was completely different, deeper, softer, carrying a gentleness even he had thought he'd lost long ago. He asked if she was all right, if she was hurt anywhere. And Maëlle gave a small shake of her head, stammering her thanks for saving her, her voice still trembling, but Dresden's eyes did not remain on her face. They were drawn to the small silver chain half hidden at the collar of her shirt, the old, chipped, swallow-shaped pendant that the struggle had pulled fully into view. He stared at it, and it took every ounce of will he had to keep his voice from breaking when he gently asked where she had gotten that pendant. The question, which sounded almost casual, immediately made Maëlle wary. Her hand rose by instinct to cover the necklace, as though she wanted to protect it, and she stepped back once more, because to her, that small object wasn't an ordinary piece of jewelry. It was the most precious and mysterious thing in her life. It was the only thing left from the birth parents she had no memory of at all. The thing she had been told was with her when she was still a baby brought into an orphanage, before she was adopted by a family. She had kept it all her life as though holding on to the only fragment of a past she could never fully know, a wordless question about where she truly came from and who she really was. So when a strange man, powerful and dangerous, suddenly asked about something so private and sacred, unease rose inside her, and she asked him softly in return, her voice guarded and bewildered, why he wanted to know, and what this necklace had to do with him. Dresden didn't answer at once. He only stood there, his eyes, once so cold, now shining with an emotion Maëlle had never seen from anyone looking at her, a mixture of fragile hope and deep, unbearable pain, and his hand slowly rose toward his own collar, where beneath the fabric, something had been carried close to his body through all those long and lonely years. Dresden's hand slipped inside his collar and slowly drew out a silver necklace he had worn close against his chest for 22 years. And when the object at the end of the chain appeared beneath the light, Maëlle's breath seemed to stop. It was also a silver swallow, old and darkened by time exactly like hers, but it had only one wing. The other wing had been broken away, leaving a jagged fracture right down the middle of the bird's body. Dresden held it out, and his hand, the same hand that only moments earlier had coldly broken another man's wrist, was now trembling faintly, and in a choked voice he could no longer bring himself to hide. He said that many years ago, there had been one single necklace split into two, each half carrying one wing of the swallow, so that a brother and sister could each keep one half. Maëlle looked from the bird in his hand to the bird at her own throat, and her whole body began to tremble as she slowly removed her necklace with fingers made clumsy by emotion. When the two halves were brought close together, when the missing wing on his swallow fit perfectly into the body of hers, forming one whole silver swallow with both wings spread wide, the entire world around Maëlle seemed to collapse and be reborn at the same time. It couldn't be a coincidence. Those two pieces had been made to belong together, and that could mean only one thing. Dresden looked straight into her eyes, and with all the pain and hope he had held back for 2 decades, he spoke the truth he had never dared believe he would one day get to say. He said her name had not begun as Maëlle, that she had once had another name when she was still a little girl, that on the horrifying night when she was only 5 years old, their parents had been murdered, and she had disappeared in the chaos, lost in the tide of life, taken into an orphanage, and raised without ever knowing who she truly was. He said that for the past 22 years, he had not gone a single day without searching for her, that he had hunted through every city, hired more people than he could count, followed more leads than he could remember, only to be shattered again and again, and that he had almost come to believe she was no longer alive. Then his voice broke when he spoke the final words, saying he was her brother, and that she was the little sister he had lost and searched for through half his life. For one long moment, Maëlle only stood there frozen, unable to speak, her mind spinning as it tried to grasp a truth too vast and too sudden. Her whole life had been an unanswered question, the quiet ache of a person who didn't know her own roots, didn't know why she had been left behind, didn't know whether anyone in this world had ever loved her or missed her. And now, standing in the middle of a mall hallway at midnight, she learned that the answer to all those questions was yes, that for 22 years, someone had never stopped looking for her, never stopped seeing her as the most precious thing in the world. At last, her tears spilled over, not the tears she had spent years forcing back, but the breaking open of all the hurt, loneliness, and longing to belong that she had buried for her entire life. She cried not because she had learned she was the sister of a powerful man, because she hadn't even begun to understand the full meaning of that yet. She cried because for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't invisible, wasn't forgotten, that there had always been someone out there aching to find her. She lifted both hands to cover her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and Dresden stood before her, his own eyes blurred, his hands rising slightly and then hesitating back down, because he longed with a burning ache to gather her into his arms, but he didn't dare, afraid he might shatter the fragile, sacred moment he had waited a whole lifetime to reach. But when that first breaking wave of emotion began to settle, when the tears had started to ease, a cold and complicated reality began slipping into Mael's mind, and she stepped back, wiping at her face as she looked at the man before her, with eyes now filled with both joy and deep confusion. Because the truth that she had a brother couldn't erase the truth of what that brother had become. She had just seen with her own eyes how he broke a man's wrist in a heartbeat, had just heard him speak the name that made even people in the underworld tremble, had just seen the way those around him lowered their heads in fear and respect, and the way he had coldly commanded Rufus's fate, as though it were an ordinary matter. The man standing before her, the man who had just wept because he had found her again, was also a crime lord, a man whose hands must have been stained with the blood of more people than she could ever know, a man standing at the head of an empire built on violence and fear. And Mael, through all the poverty of her life, no matter how much she had been trampled on and looked down upon, had always kept her own hands clean, had always believed in goodness as the last and most precious possession no one could take from her. Now she was being torn between two things that seemed impossible to reconcile. On one side, the burning longing to belong somewhere, to have a family, to fill the emptiness she had carried all her life, and on the other side, the fear and moral principles that had shaped the person she was. She asked him softly, her voice trembling, whether the rumors about him were true, whether he really was the man everyone had seemed so afraid of. And when she looked into his eyes, she already had her answer before he could even speak. Dresden didn't deny it. He didn't try to paint himself as a better man than he truly was, because he understood that lying to her from this very first moment would be the worst kind of betrayal. He only quietly admitted that he had done many things he could never wash away, that his world was a dark one he had never wanted her to step into, and that he wasn't asking her to forgive him or accept him at once. Mael felt her chest tighten, because she realized that life had just given her the thing she had longed for most, a blood relative, a home to belong to, but had wrapped it in a form that every value she believed in had to reject. She thought of her adoptive mother waiting at home, the woman who had taken her in with all the love she had despite their poverty, and she wondered whether stepping into the world of this newly found brother would betray everything she had been raised to become. Tears rose in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of confusion and pain, and she told him in a choked voice that she needed time, that she couldn't accept all of this in a single night, that knowing he was her brother didn't mean she could close her eyes to the person he had become. Dresden nodded silently, and though those words cut through him, he understood and respected them, because that very uncompromising honesty in her, that clean conscience, that even a brutal life hadn't been able to extinguish, only made him more certain that the woman standing before him truly was the little sister he had always dreamed of, and that no matter how much more time it took, he was willing to wait. When the emotion settled and reason slowly returned, Mael looked around the hall, and a bitter truth appeared clearly before her eyes. The store employees who had been hiding behind the counters moments earlier were now looking at her with an entirely different gaze, no longer the indifferent passing glance reserved for an invisible janitor, but a look of astonishment mixed with caution as they watched the most powerful man they had ever seen treat her like something precious. She suddenly realized how cruelly ironic it was that only a few hours ago, right here in this very place, a group of young people had mocked her body, had treated her as something that ruined the elegance of their surroundings, had looked at her as though she didn't deserve to exist in their world. And now the truth had been laid bare, that the woman this entire building had looked down on for years, the woman a criminal had believed was so worthless she could be allowed to die, was in fact the most important person to the man before whom the city's entire underworld bowed its head. But what made Mael different, what formed her true worth, was that she felt no satisfaction or triumph in that change. She did not look at those who had once despised her with revenge in her eyes, because she understood that her value had never changed, either before or after the truth was revealed. She had always been that same woman, with that same heart, that same dignity, even when she was quietly mopping floors in a faded uniform and being ignored by the whole world. The sudden respect of the people around her did not make her more valuable. It only revealed how terribly wrong they had been to measure a human being's worth by appearance, wait, or work. That very moment quietly taught everyone who witnessed it a lesson, without the need for a single sermon, that no one should ever judge another person by outward appearance, because the person we look down on today may be the one most deserving of respect, and because true dignity does not lie in status or money, but in the way a person lives and treats others. Maëlle turned back to Dresden, and with a calmness and clarity that even surprised him, she began stating her conditions. She said that if he truly wanted her to be part of his life, then he had to respect the person she had built herself into through her own sweat and tears. She said she would not give up her job simply because she now knew she had a wealthy brother, because that work, however ordinary it might seem in other people's eyes, was still the honest way she earned her living, and it was her own private pride. She said she didn't need his money or his power to prove her worth, that she had lived her whole life without those things, and she was still herself. And more important than everything else, she spoke about the adoptive mother lying sick at home, the woman who had taken her in and loved her unconditionally through all those years, and she laid down one condition that could not be negotiated, that no matter what happened, her adoptive mother had to be cared for properly and given full medical treatment, because to Maëlle, that woman would always be her mother, the true family who had chosen to love her when she had been no one at all. Dresden listened to every word she said, and instead of taking offense at her firmness, he felt respect rising inside him, because he realized that his sister, despite growing up in hardship and deprivation, had kept a strength of character and a sense of self-respect that money could never buy. He gave a small nod and agreed to all of her conditions without the slightest hesitation, and in that moment, between two people who came from worlds separated by an entire sky, the first quiet seed of understanding began to take root. The following night, Crestline Galleria sank once again into its familiar silence as the last customers left, and Maëlle was still there, still in her gray janitor's uniform, still with the mop in her hands, quietly pushing it in long strokes across the glossy tile floor the way she had done for so many years. She didn't quit her job, didn't immediately step into a life of silk and luxury, because she was still the same person, someone who believed that honest work was something to be proud of and that her dignity didn't depend on how much money she had. But one thing had changed. Outside in the parking lot, beneath the dim yellow streetlights, an elegant black car sat quietly in a shadowed corner, and inside it were people watching her from a distance, not to control her or interfere with her life, but only to protect her in silence, to make sure that woman would never have to face danger alone again. Maëlle knew the car was there, and for the first time in her long, weary life, she worked in silence without feeling lonely. Her adoptive mother had now been moved to a better hospital, cared for with tenderness and attention, and the burden of medical bills that had weighed so heavily on Maëlle's shoulders through so many long nights had finally been lifted. Not through arrogant charity, but through the love of a brother who had learned to respect his sister's conditions and her dignity. The secret of her true identity was still being kept from the outside world. No one at the mall knew that the quiet janitor was the sister of one of the most powerful men in the city, and she wanted it to stay that way, because she had never needed anyone to know that in order to feel that she had value. Maëlle Fontaine's story did not close with a sudden, dazzling change of fortune, but with something far more precious: healing, understanding, and the belief that no matter how harsh life becomes, goodness and dignity will always remain a light nothing can extinguish. And if there is one thing this story wishes to leave with all of us, it is this: never judge a person by outward appearance, by weight, by clothing, or by the work they do, because behind every person we casually pass by or look down on, there may be an entire story, a heart, a worth we never could have imagined. And the respect we show to others is the truest measure of our own character. Every person who crosses our path deserves to be seen with kindness, because no one in this world is invisible, and no one is without value. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please press the subscribe button for our channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we can listen together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories about human life. How do you feel about Maëlle's story? And do you see, somewhere in the life around you, quiet people who are being forgotten just like her? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from deep within your heart, because we truly want to hear your sincere stories and emotions. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment, and may everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.